You're watching This Week in Space with Miles O'Brien. Brought to you by Binary Space. Reliable space systems.
Hello and welcome. We begin at the end this week, the end of an era in space. Well, maybe. This was the scene at the Kennedy Space Center on Wednesday. Commander Ken Ham dead-sticking Atlantis down the steep glide slope to runway 33. The mission, STS-132, was the final scheduled flight of Atlantis. But she's not heading straight to the museums. She's now back in her orbiter processing facility, that's NASA speak for a hangar, where she will be prepped for a flight on short notice should there be trouble on the remaining pair of shuttle missions. But the museums might have to wait even longer. NASA is leaving the door open to schedule an encore mission for Atlantis. Since there would be no rescue vehicle at the ready, she would likely fly with a scaled-down crew that would use the Russian Soyuz as a lifeboat. NASA will make a decision on this by mid-June. Maybe the shuttle program will end as it began, with a two-person crew. For those of you keeping score at home, if it turns out this was the last ride to space for OV-104, here are her final game stats. 32 flights, 11 of those to the International Space Station, over 120 million miles on the odometer, 294 days in orbit, 4,649 revolutions around Earth. She was home away from home for 189 astronauts. She carried the Magellan and Galileo interplanetary probes to space, as well as the Compton Gamma Ray Observatory. She was the first orbiter to dock with the Russian space station Mir, and the last one to visit the Hubble Space Telescope. Not bad at all. Way to go, Atlantis. Way to go. Well, he's the E.F. Hutton of astronauts. When he talks, people listen. Or would Greta Garbo be a better analogy, maybe? Or maybe even J.D. Salinger. Anyway, I digress. You guessed it, I'm talking about Neil Armstrong, the first person to walk on the moon, a bona fide national hero, and a man who chooses his words carefully. He's been speaking out recently in opposition to the Obama administration's plan to kill the moonshot program, known as Constellation. This week, he took center stage again at a House Science and Technology Committee hearing. He reiterated his support for Constellation in particular and a return to the moon in general. The man has a lifetime supply of dry powder, and he fired at will.
The issue facing this meeting has produced substantial turmoil among space advocates. So many normally knowledgeable people were completely astounded by the President's proposal. Had the announcement been preceded by a more typical review, analysis, and discussion among the executive branch, the agency, this Congress, and all the other interested and knowledgeable parties, no member of this committee would have been surprised by the announcement of a new plan. In this case, a normally collegial sector of society was split in many fragments. Some focused on contracts and money, some on workforce and jobs, some on technical choices, all because a few planners with little or no space operations experience attempted an end run on the normal planning process, and it has been painful to watch.
Armstrong was joined by the last man to walk on the moon, Apollo 17 Commander Gene Cernan, who also took aim at Obama's plan, which he views as long on talk and short on funds. In other words, show me the money.
And when one comes to examine the details of the 2011 budget proposal, nowhere can be found, not one penny allocated to support space exploration. Yes, there has been much rhetoric about transformative technology, heavy lift propulsion, research, robotic precursor missions, as well as other worthwhile endeavors in their own right. Yet nowhere do we find any mention of human exploration of space, and nowhere do we find a commitment in dollars to support this all-important endeavor. We, Neil Armstrong, Jim Lovell, and myself, have come to the unanimous conclusion that this budget proposal presents no challenges, has no focus, and is in fact a blueprint for a mission to nowhere.
NASA Administrator Charlie Bolden was also on hand, testifying earlier in the day. He disclosed that it will cost an estimated $4.5 billion over 5 years to implement Obama's recently announced plan to turn the Orion capsule into an ISS lifeboat, money that NASA will have to take out of other programs. And he assured the committee that NASA is continuing work on Constellation in good faith. Yes, the work goes on until Congress weighs in, because that is the way the law is written. Bolden got an earful from Arizona's Gabrielle Giffords over NASA's just announced decision to reassign the outspoken Constellation program manager, Jeff Hanley.
Mr. Bolden, my concern is, particularly considering the news that we had last week, that the program manager was actually working hard to try to make the program work given the constraints of the budget. But again, from where we sit, his work to restructure and potentially save the parts of Constellation that need to be saved, by removing him from his position, I think, it demonstrates to us that the question I asked you earlier, whether or not you would give this committee your assurance that you are doing everything that you can as the NASA administrator to make progress with Constellation for the remainder of the fiscal year 2010, when the Constellation manager is removed from his position, it frankly makes me personally very dubious that that is in fact happening. So I'm wondering, again, the assurance that you can give to us in the United States Congress that you're actually carrying this out, and whether or not the program will carry forward, and whether or not you are planning on replacing him with someone who's competent and replacing him with someone expeditiously.
We would replace him with someone who is incredibly competent. I don't think I have anyone in the hierarchy of the Constellation program or anywhere that is not competent and has my confidence. And Jeff Hanley is not leaving NASA. Jeff Hanley is moving up to become the Deputy Director at the Johnson Space Center for Strategic Studies and Strategic Plans. He is an incredibly talented individual, and Jeff and I have spoken for quite some time, since I became the NASA administrator, about his future.
Thank you, Mr. Bolden.
While Constellation would be the loser under the new Obama plan, the winners are commercial space companies looking to taxi astronauts and cargo to low Earth orbit. And no one is more out in front on that than Elon Musk of SpaceX. We're still waiting to hear a launch date for the first flight of his Falcon 9 rocket, but it's definitely getting close. We'll keep you posted on that. Check in with us at Spaceflight Now for the latest. I Skyped Elon last week, and I asked him about Neil Armstrong's opposition to the Obama plan. His reply was interesting, to say the least.
I'm sorry, but I think Neil Armstrong is being manipulated, and it is a sorry sight indeed, because of course he's a national hero. Now, on the other hand, Buzz Aldrin. I think if people are going to look to national heroes for advice on the future of space, there's Neil Armstrong, who's a great man, and then there's Buzz Aldrin, who's also a great man. Now, Buzz Aldrin is the guy with the PhD from MIT, and Neil is a pilot. That's nothing wrong with being a pilot. That's cool. But if you're going to look for somebody to render judgment, technical judgment on what program makes the most sense, I think you would probably pick the PhD from MIT rather than the pilot. And Buzz Aldrin, PhD from MIT, is the one that is a huge fan of the Obama policy.
Wow, I guess it's official. Nothing is sacred anymore. Strange times indeed in the space world. Never has a group of passionate people who agree on so much been so deeply at odds. And never have Apollo astronauts been so outspoken about anything. You have to wonder how things got so polarized, and you have to also wonder how hard it would be to find a third way. All of this made me think of my good friend Andy Chaikin, author of A Man on the Moon, and more recently, A Passion for Mars, Intrepid Explorers of the Red Planet. I Skyped him the other day. Andy Chaikin, good to have you on This Week in Space. First off, before we get into some other matters, are you a little surprised at the tone of the debate right now, and in particular, hearing the Apollo astronauts being so vocal at this juncture?
I guess I'm a little surprised that it's taken this long for them to weigh in. I mean, we've known for 6 years that the shuttle was going to be retired this year. We knew that there would be a gap. We also knew for about that length of time that the money was not as much as people had hoped, and that, for example, the whole lunar portion of Constellation was not funded. It was pretty much vaporware. And we really had some problems that were going to come back to bite us that we had to grapple with. So I guess I'm surprised that it's taken this long, and I'm also a little frustrated in general with the polarized nature of the debate. I would say that there's a lot more heat than light being thrown off of this debate right now, and that's not going to get us where we all want to go.
All right, well, too much heat and not enough light. Why don't you put a little light on it? Let's think, it's very polarized right now. I've been struggling to come up with a third way, a compromise. I know you have some thoughts. Help us find a way.
Well, to me, one of the most important issues, perhaps the most important issue that really needs to be dealt with, and this time period really does give us an opportunity to think about it, is how do you finally break the back of the cost of getting into low Earth orbit? That's been a problem since the beginning of the space age. It's still $10,000 a pound to get up there, just that first 200 miles and 17,500 miles an hour. And to me, it's like you want to go have a great weekend in New York City, but they're charging you $10,000 to go over the toll bridge. Well, it doesn't matter what kind of grand plans you have for the city if you can't get in there to begin with. And I look back at the history of aviation when you look at the way the air industry got started, the airlines. And in the 20s, they had an airplane called the Ford Trimotor that was the first passenger-carrying airplane of any really widespread significance. But it was really it was a program of development in the 1920s, much of it conducted at NASA's precursor, the NACA, which led to a number of technological advances that gave us the DC-3, which became the workhorse of commercial aviation and actually showed that you could turn a profit by carrying passengers. Now, it's always risky to make comparisons between spacecraft and airplanes because the physics of getting into space is so much more demanding. But my point is, let's take the creativity that we have out there, both outside NASA at places like SpaceX and Bigelow, and even inside NASA where people would love to tackle these kinds of problems. Let's put that to work in a kind of a national technology development goal of finally breaking the back of this cost to entry. And then once you find a way to get up into low Earth orbit relatively reliably, relatively cheaply, and relatively safely, then the whole space frontier starts to open up and you can go all the places that we want to go. So, and by the way, I would be happy with any place outside of low Earth orbit. To me, that's exploration. Let's go into deep space, and I'm not feeling particularly choosy about where that is, but we've got to solve this problem of barrier to entry of low Earth orbit.
Is it important in that mix to have the private sector in on the game in a different way than it has been so far? No more cost-plus contracts, and what will that do to hasten the day when it's cheaper to get to low Earth orbit?
I'm not qualified to pass judgment on the way we do business. I can only tell you that there has to be a change to get us where we want to go, and I worry that we're perpetuating old ways of doing business because it becomes so politically difficult to change that. I mean, back in the 1980s, Deke Slayton, who was one of the giants of NASA, said that the space station program even then had become something of an aerospace WPA. And this is part of the evolution of organizations, large organizations, that eventually they become, they transform into something different from the way they started. And I think you need to have, obviously it's NASA's program, but you need to get that openness to different ways of doing business as well as new technological approaches. So yeah, look at the way SpaceX is doing business. Can they really cut the cost over the massive overhead that NASA has to deal with? Can they do it safely with NASA oversight? That remains to be seen, but I think we should certainly be trying, and not only one way, but multiple ways. We should really be trying to do every possible way that we can to get to that final goal.
Words of wisdom from Andy Chaikin. Thanks for your time.
My pleasure, Miles.
Now, here's a story of cooperation in space. X-Corp Aerospace and Masten Space Systems are teaming up with their eye on a big prize. They're buddying up to try to win some NASA-sponsored unmanned lunar lander projects. Now, last year, you may recall, Masten won the $1 million first prize for Level 2 of NASA's Lunar Lander Challenge. Masten's Zoe craft had to take off and land vertically, fly horizontally, and make a round trip between two landing sites on a simulated moonscape. X-Corp is a leader in next-generation rockets and propulsion systems. Companies are neighbors at the Mojave Spaceport and will no doubt be the team to beat. Also, Masten's chief competitor for that Lunar Lander Challenge last year, Armadillo Aerospace, is teaming up with Space Adventures. They are getting into the suborbital tourism racket. The companies are aiming to charge $102,000 for a trip 62 miles into the blue or black yonder and 5 minutes of weightlessness. That's about half of what a ticket on Virgin Galactic is going for, but roughly on par with what a ride on the Lynx is supposed to cost. The Lynx is the suborbital space plane under development by X-Corp. None of the companies has announced a date when they'll actually start flying. It's nice to see a price war, though. A little competition is a good thing, you know. A Delta IV rocket left Launch Pad 37B at the Cape on Thursday night, and it's safe to say this one didn't ask for directions. It contains the latest and greatest addition to the Global Positioning System satellite fleet. The GPS 2F1 promises to offer improved accuracy, a more jam-resistant signal, a longer design life, and a better signal for civil use, for those of us who use GPS but aren't in the military. If this satellite goes astray, it is equipped with a stern woman's voice who will scold the satellite, telling it it is off route and recalculating. And Arianespace has launched its 50th Ariane 5 rocket from Europe's spaceport in French Guiana. The payload on this rocket included 2 telecommunications satellites. Astra 3B will provide direct-to-home and broadband to Europe and the Middle East. ComSat BW2 is a German military satellite. Afterwards, the German general in charge said, "We deserve a glass of champagne," prompting the French to go, "Oui, oui." What happens when galaxies collide? Well, they pull over to the side, call the cops, and the insurance company probably, right? But new data from a NASA satellite called SWIFT has turned up some smoking gun evidence that galaxy collisions can really amp up the energy emitted by supermassive black holes that reside at their centers. Turns out such violent mergers generate so-called hard X-rays, exactly the type of energy SWIFT was designed to sniff out. Astronomers have wondered for years why a relatively small number of black holes emit vast amounts of energy. Seems it all has to do with a clash between neighbors. You know what they say, good black holes make good neighbors. A little closer to home, in Mars orbit, the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter has beamed back some interesting data that is giving scientists a sense of what lies beneath the ice cap covering the Martian North Pole. The shallow radar instrument aboard MRO can penetrate the ice to take a look at the rock formations underneath, giving scientists clues to what forces shape the cap's distinctive canyons and spiral troughs. The new data suggests they were actually sculpted by wind over millions of years as the ice sheet grew. And take a look at these images from MRO. They confirm what we told you last week, that the Phoenix Mars lander is officially Tango uniform, toes up. The top shot was taken by MRO's HiRISE camera in 2008, and it shows 2 gleaming solar arrays. The bottom shot from last month shows an asymmetrical shadow. Apparently one of the solar arrays broke off under the weight of hundreds of pounds of dry ice. Mission managers had tasked the Mars Odyssey spacecraft to listen for signs of life from Phoenix in recent months, hoping that against the odds, the little lander might wake up after a cold, dark winter in the Martian northern polar region. But they never heard a peep. Rest in peace. We hope to hear a thing or two from you. Please stay in touch. Send us your darts or laurels to us via email, twist@spaceflightnow.com, via Twitter @thisweekinspace. Check out the blog, milesobrien.com. And while you're at our site, spaceflightnow.com/twist, please consider giving us a small donation via PayPal. We really could use your support. And speaking of that, thanks to our one and only sponsor, the loyal and supportive Binary Space. We really appreciate it. Next week, a crew change on the International Space Station. TJ Creamer and Soichi Noguchi will come home authors of the first and best tweets from space, like this one from Soichi, a shot of Atlantis streaking through the atmosphere on its way to KSC. We will miss them up there, but they are, I'm sure, ready for pizza and sushi, I suppose. The latest on their arrival and much more. We'll see you then.